Hi, my name is Cece Nilsson, and today I'm going to be discussing the evolution of twin studies. So in this video, just going to do some basic background on twins and genetics, and then we're going to get into a sort of timeline of twin studies, starting from the very start in the 20th century and then ending all the way up in 2018. Okay, so to start the background, we are just going to talk about twins first off. We're going to talk about how exactly twins occur and then why they play such an important role in research for genetics. So first off, there are two different types of twins. There's identical or monozygotic, and then there's fraternal or dizygotic. And fraternal twins come from two different eggs and two different sperm, but it happens during the same menstrual cycle, resulting in two babies or embryos that each have a different genome. And then identical twins result from the same sperm and the same egg, and the embryo actually ends up splitting into two, but they still share the same placenta, and these twins will have the same genome. And so why are twins so fascinating to geneticists? Well, as I just mentioned, when two different human beings have exactly the same genome, it's a lot easier to compare and contrast different aspects of both their personality and their physical makeup. As we'll talk about later in this video, some twins were separated at birth, so while they have the same genome and they have the same nature, they were nurtured differently and they grew up in different environments. So studying twins can be really helpful for figuring out what genes are impacted more by the environment and what genes are impacted more just inherently from when a person is created. And so for more of a personal background or connection that I have to this topic that kind of inspired me to make this video was I recently got the opportunity to go to the Indiana Medical History Museum, and the building in which the museum is set up was once the pathology building for Central State Hospital. The hospital opened in the mid-19th century and it ended up closing in the 1990s. But they had, in just this one building alone, they had a chemistry lab, they had a histology lab, they had a bacteriology lab, which is now microbiology, and they had their own autopsy room. They really had everything. They had their own specimen collection. So they really had everything all at this one hospital. So they were treating patients as well as conducting their own research. And they had a lot of connections to academia as well. And this experience really just allowed me to see how different medical settings and practices were back when some of these twin studies were conducted, because as we'll see on the next slide, the first idea of twin studies was in 1875. So yeah, and in the hospital, well, not this hospital specifically, but during this time period, the treatment of patients was pretty controversial, to say the least. A lot of just trying to make patients more docile and easy to work with rather than to actually help them and better their quality of life. And as we will get to on the next few slides, some of the motivations for certain medical practices were very ethically questionable, and that kind of is going to lead us into our first section for twin studies. So when it comes to twin studies in particular, the most accepted place to start would be with Sir Francis Galton and his work titled The History of Twins that was put out in 1875. So Galton was a British researcher, and he was actually cousins with Charles Darwin, who made the theory of evolution and created this idea of natural selection. And Galton really took inspiration from his cousin, and instead of applying it to animals like Darwin did with finches, Galton decided to apply these theories to humans. And so during this time, I think it should be noted that there was a quote-unquote threat of immigration. The Industrial Revolution in both the United States and Europe was in full force, so there wasn't a huge influx of the amount of immigrants coming to both the UK and the US, and this sort of sparked a fear among many people. And I think that Galton's personal reactions and fear of these immigrants definitely influenced his research and his ideas. And so when it came to his actual study of twins, he sent out a survey of, I believe, 80 questions to these numerous sets of twins, and he looked for differences in their responses. So he would just ask questions like, do you and your twin have the same eye color per se? And then they would say basically yes or no. And one of the main differences that he was able to identify was between the handwriting of twins. Twins who are physically identical, I guess, manage to have different handwriting more often than not, despite their physical similarities. He also determined that these twins had similar identities and personalities, and even when almost everything was completely similar, there was always one identifying difference between them, and he found that the mother in particular of the twins was usually able to identify them and tell them apart from one another. But through this survey, Galton came to the conclusion that nature, or the way that a person is due to their genetics and how they were born, has more of an impact on a human being than nurture, or how they were raised and brought up in the environment around them. So I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide to talk about this now, because I think that after hearing about the way he conducted his research, that his sort of bias will make more sense with the results that he got. So along with kind of being the father of twin studies, Galton is also considered the father of eugenics. And eugenics is basically, trying to put it lightly, is to alter the nature of humans to be better. And so, along with the background that I gave with the influx of immigrants at this time period, Galton really wanted to quote-unquote improve the race. And so he saw traits such as intelligence and just being physically healthy as superior or positive traits. He saw other traits such as being less intelligent or being poor even. He saw those as negative traits. And so he really wanted to change the way that people are made, because as we saw with his the conclusions from his research, he believed that the way that people are made has more of an influence on them than the way they are raised and brought up in the environment around them. And so eugenics has obviously had a very controversial place in genetics, and rightfully so. There are positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is just basically encouraging people with quote-unquote positive and good traits to have children and reproduce, and then negative eugenics is the opposite, which is discouraging and or preventing reproduction among people who have quote-unquote negative or undesirable traits. And so it's kind of unavoidable, like you cannot talk about Galton without bringing up the influence that eugenics had on the research he conducted, and we'll see that later on in this video as well, that eugenics has had a big influence on just genetics as a whole. So yeah, now we're going to talk about Jablonski, I believe is how you pronounce it. He is often overlooked when it comes to discussing who conducted the first modern twin study, but he released this article in a German paper in 1922, so I put him here for that reason. And he was an ophthalmologist, and he used both identical and fraternal twins to study differences in eye refraction. So I'm gonna be totally honest, I don't completely know how the corneal refraction is calculated, but on the sense of twins, Jablonski did make the connection that the identical twins more often than not had a noticeably smaller difference in corneal refraction than the fraternal twins did. And he made a graph, which I have shown on the slide, comparing the number of refractions, and then that's on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the within pair difference. So it's just the difference between the two twins. And so yeah, he was the first person, whereas Galton was just kind of surveying and asking questions. Jablonski was actually looking up close at these twins and studying them and calculating the difference between their makeup, just with more, I think, statistical, actual data, whereas Galton's was more so just by word of mouth. And so then that kind of leads us on to Simons and Merriman, who both published two different papers in 1924. And so both Simons and Merriman have also been discussed when it comes to who actually conducted the first modern twin study along with Jablonski, but their papers came out 2 years later. So it was difficult to find exactly what was published by both Simons and Merriman, but from what I could find, Merriman published an article in 1924 titled The Intellectual Resemblance of Twins, Psychological Monographs, and it was a study that really focused on the intellectual behavior of twins, and it was mostly focused on intellect more than anything else. And then Simons published a book, or he wrote for a book in 1924, and the book was called Twin Pathology, except in German, which is a word that I'm not going to try to pronounce. But he was a dermatologist, and he looked at more of the physical differences between twins, and he found that when it came to moles or birthmarks with twins, he concluded that identical twins would have more similarities than fraternal twins. So kind of just all three, Jablonski, Merriman, and Simons, all came to the conclusion that identical twins have more similarities than identical twins. And so now we are going to talk about Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, and how they did twin studies. During Hitler's rule in Germany, twin studies were very common, and they were something that was like particularly interesting to the Nazi Party, going back to Galton's initial bias with his idea of eugenics. The Nazis definitely took that initial idea and really just, I wouldn't want to say advanced it, but they took it to a different level for sure. And so I think it goes without saying that the Nazi Party was definitely very just racist, to put it how it is. They obviously valued the Aryan race more than anything else, and so when it came to studying eugenics or genetics and heredity, they definitely had a very strong bias, and they were obviously looking for kind of what Galton described as this sort of superior race, and they wanted to quote-unquote improve the race too. And so I'm not going to pronounce this name totally correctly, but Otmar von Verscher was a German geneticist and biologist, and he did a lot of these studies that were kind of overseen by the Nazi Party. And Joseph Mengele was also a physician in Germany who also helped conduct a lot of these twin studies. And so the way the Nazi Party conducted these were mostly anthropometric studies, which is just similar to sort of what Galton did. It's just physical, not totally similar to what Galton did, but it's focusing mainly on the physical aspects and the visual traits that you can see between these twins. And so they would focus a lot on height, eye color, hair color, weight, different, like the length between your wrist to your elbow and things like that, just because they were, as I mentioned, really trying to build this sort of superior race of people. But then something else that I found that was really interesting when it comes to the twin studies performed by Nazi Germany is they actually had this town or village in Brazil that has an abnormally high percent of twin births in it, and it's suspected that it is caused by the twin studies performed by Joseph Mengele. I was reading up on this and wasn't able to find out exactly how it ended up being in Brazil, but just due to the sort of small scale of people that they had together, and then they were reproducing, and so now there's a whole town of twins in Brazil due to studies that happened in Germany. So I just thought that was really interesting. And yeah, kind of moving on to, at least in my opinion, somewhat more recent, in 1979 there was a paper produced by researchers at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and it was called Sources of Human Psychological Differences, the Minnesota Study of Twins Reared Apart. And so, as I mentioned kind of at the very start of this video, this is kind of a big reason why twins are so important to genetics. I think everything that we've talked about up to this point is very important, but it also is kind of very visual and going based off of just like the physical appearance and aspects of these people rather than their actual psychological state. And so the Minnesota study of twins reared apart really focused on identical twins who were separated at birth or very, very early on into their lives, and then they grew up apart in different environments, and that they compared those twins to twins who had grown up together in the same environment, and they actually found that twins who grew up reared apart had the same chances or likelihood of like being similar. They had like the same amount of similarities as twins who did grow up together, which kind of goes way back to kind of support and corroborate Galton's initial idea that nature has more of like an influence on a person than nurture, which I thought was really interesting because when it comes to psychology, I feel like it's a lot more complex, and it's a lot more likely to have psychological differences based on your environment than like your physical differences, I guess, but that's just my opinion. So anyways, what this study found is that identical twins that were separated at birth still showed behavioral similarities and interests and similar levels of intelligence regardless of their environment, and their IQ scores particularly were pretty consistent. And then they sort of go on to speculate as to why these twins who grew up in different environments had so many similarities still, and they kind of landed on the same conclusion that Galton landed on 100 years earlier, and that was that the genome and the way that these people were born has a much stronger influence on all of these different aspects than the environment that they're in. And they also speculated that a person's genetic kind of factors can influence and sort of control the effect that the environment has on them. So I don't know, I just thought that was an interesting take on it. And now moving on to very recently, we're going to talk about NASA and the Kelly brothers. So this was a study that was in total 25 months long, but I believe the twin that was in the International Space Station was there for about 304 days. And so, yeah, like I said, the study that they conducted, a big part of it involved one of the Kelly brothers being up in the International Space Station for a long period of time, and then the other brother was still on Earth throughout this entire study. And so they compared a lot of different factors, such as their physical makeup. They tested they did a lot of blood tests. They tested, they did cognitive tests on them, tests on their immune system, tests on their metabolic system. Yeah, they collected a ton of data on these two brothers, and then they collected data for a while before they sent the one up into the International Space Station. Then they collected data while he was there, and then they collected data after he got back as well. And the main goal of this study was to kind of try to figure out, okay, what are going to be the biggest dangers when it comes to space travel? Like, what should these astronauts be kind of looking out for? How is this going to impact humans? And so they found in particular that, I think this was kind of expected, but they found that they had the biggest differences during both takeoff, when first kind of going out to the space station, and while coming back down to Earth. That kind of spiked the biggest changes between things such as telomere length and also gene regulation, which I thought was really interesting. So they did note in this study that a lot of these factors that did have significant changes, not everything had significant changes, but the things that did have significant changes did end up going back down to a similar level that they were at before going to space, which was good. So, obviously can't totally conclude, but it seems like there are not a lot of severe, long-lasting dangers when it comes to space travel, at least on a genetic level. But when it comes to gene regulation in particular, there was the biggest sort of notes in like how the immune system was working, which I feel like could be a concern. Obviously 304 days in space is a very long time, but when you think about people possibly being up there for multiple years, it kind of raises these questions. But yeah, things such as insulin and estrogen really changed notably, and white blood cells as well. It's just, yeah, your immune system is weakened when you go thousands, I don't even know, millions maybe of miles into the air and into our atmosphere. And so for the last, I don't know if this would be completely considered a study, but the last quote-unquote twin study that we are going to talk about is the one conducted by He Jiankui. I definitely pronounced that wrong, but he was a Chinese scientist, and he genetically edited the genes of these two twin girls. Their pseudonyms are Lulu and Nana, and this happened in 2018, so very recently. And this sort of situation, I guess, was a very big talking point and sparked a lot of controversy, and I don't know, it gained a lot of attention and traction across the entire world when it happened, just with ethical issues, which we will get into. So what exactly happened was, it was initially, from what I read, said that the attempt was to lessen the chance that either of these twin girls would contract the HIV virus. However, I did read another article stating that the sort of experiment per se did not do that, and that these girls were not at any sort of abnormal risk for HIV, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, so we're going to talk about CRISPR for this. And so to put it in layman's terms, because that is what I am best at, CRISPR is a sort of tool that is going to allow these scientists, geneticists, to modify DNA by cutting specific sequences and replacing them. And so it uses a guide RNA, this isn't the Cas9, to sort of redirect this enzyme into a specific DNA sequence, and then once the DNA strands are cut, they put in this sort of foreign DNA, and with the way that it's going to like recopy itself, it's going to just go and copy this foreign DNA rather than the one that they determined was mutated. And so this has mainly been used only in research settings. Rather, at this point in time, it hasn't really been used widespread as like a sort of treatment for specific genetic disorders. But in this instance, Dr. He Jiankui did go in and he edited the CCR5 genes of these twins, but as I have kind of bulleted on the slide here, there was a difference in how this was done to each of the twins. One twin only had one CCR5 gene removed and the other had two. So hypothetically, one of the twins is going to be more at risk for developing HIV than the other one. But yeah, overall this was just a really big kind of deal when it comes to the ethical aspect of gene editing, because like I mentioned, up to this point it wasn't really actually enacted on people, and it just comes down mostly to what exactly do we consider to be positive and negative genes, just kind of like going all the way back to the start of this with Galton, and his idea of eugenics is he had classified certain genes to be good and certain genes to be bad, and obviously it's completely subjective. It's not really black and white, and it's obviously every person is going to have a different opinion. And then on top of that, it's sort of coming into like the quote-unquote playing God, and it's these people who, obviously these twins, like, they were embryos at this point, or they had no sort of consent into their genes being edited, and they had they just had no say in it. So then it comes to the point of like what you think would be best for someone else, when the only person who can really sort of say what would be the best for them is the person themselves. So yeah, caused a big uproar in the scientific community, and the doctors that partook in this gene editing were sentenced to prison for 3 years for this, and they were stripped of their licenses, I believe. So yeah, not really an actual twin study, but it involved twins, and I think it's important to bring up some of the ethical concerns when it comes to genetics in particular. So that is the end of the video that I have. Here are some of my sources. I will link them in the video description down below. So thank you for watching, and I hope you were able to learn something from this, and yeah, bye.